Hello, and welcome to Cognitive Psychology. We're going to start off with a nice brief history of the field of cognitive psychology and an introduction to the types of things that we'll be covering during this quarter. So, first of all, the definition of cognitive psychology is that it is the scientific study of mental processing. That includes things like perception. That would be how we pay attention to things in our environment, how we identify things in our environment, how we classify those things. Memory, which would include your immediate memory for things, your long-term memory for things that happened in the past, your autobiographical memory, those things that have happened specifically to you. And then also memory distortions that occur when we recall things that never really happened or we forget things that did. Language, which would be our ability to produce, I want to say spoken, but verbal I think is probably a better word because it doesn't have to be spoken, it could be written. And then also how we receive that. So how we understand spoken language, how we understand written language, signed language, things like that. And then reasoning would be our decision-making capabilities, our problem-solving abilities, any shortcomings that tend to occur in those things. So when we talk about mental processing, we're talking about a lot of things that happen inside a person's head that are not directly observable. And so that makes it tricky to study because we have to figure out ways to get the person who we're studying to produce some kind of output that would make it clear that they have perceived something, for example, or that they remember something, or that they, understood what was said or written down or signed, or how, what exact steps went into their decision making or their problem solving. So it's a tricky topic because we have to figure out ways to know for sure that these mental processes occurred inside a person's head. So, the field of cognitive science is a broad field that includes cognitive psychology as part of it, neuroscience as another part of it. Neuroscience really looks at the connection, the relationship between the brain and its structures and its chemicals, and then how the person actually thinks, what a lot of people would call the mind. Artificial intelligence is also part of cognitive science, how we can use the computer as a model for the human mind, how we can get a computer to think like a human mind, for example, much more quickly than computers used to do and in a more complex way. Cognitive science also includes anthropology. This is looking at the mind through the lens of culture, and that includes not just across culture in modern times, but also attempting to understand the mind of ancient peoples who are no longer here, but they've left remnants that we can then infer. Linguistics, that's another field of anthropology actually, and it examines language. And so in cognitive science, we're really interested in what language can tell us about the human mind, how people use their minds, how people think about things as a function of the language that they use. And then finally, philosophy is another contributor to the field of cognitive science. Philosophy has really provided a lot of the fundamental questions that really define the field of cognitive science. So we're talking about a small part of this larger field called cognitive science when we talk about cognitive psychology. You're going to notice across the quarter that these other areas are going to come up as appropriate. When we talk about language, we're going to talk about linguistics. And when we talk about, a variety of different aspects of cognition, brain structures are going to be important. And so you're going to notice that we're going to talk about the other areas of cognitive science, but this is not a cognitive science class. And so we will be focusing on cognitive psychology. So what is a science? It really is the methodology that's used to answer questions, right? A lot of times people think that science is somehow defined by its subject matter, whether you are studying something that is directly observable and knowable, as opposed to whether you are using methods that would allow you to observe and know. So methodology is really what determines a science. One of the most important things in the world of science is the establishment of a paradigm. a paradigm is a theory that is so well supported, it's basically taken as a given by the entire field. It's sort of the starting point for the field. So a good example of a paradigm would be evolution, right? It's something that is so well supported that basically everyone takes it as a given. That doesn't mean that people aren't testing it and attempting to falsify the theory of evolution, looking for evidence that it might be wrong. But until that evidence is provided, everyone is just taking it as, okay, so we'll all accept that evolution is the starting point. Let's go from there. In psychology, we don't have as many paradigms. So when you have a paradigm, you have this period of normalcy where everybody's sort of saying, okay, that's our starting point. We all agree this is our starting point. And then that leads us to look for anomalies. If we all have a basic starting point, we can all be looking for ways to undermine that starting point to make sure that it really is right. That's the point, is to test the paradigm by attempting to falsify it. If it continues to stand up in the face of falsification, it gains more power. But if we can find anomalies, evidence that it might be wrong, then that's going to put the field into crisis as we have to decide, what are we going to do about the fact that we found this piece of evidence that doesn't go along with the paradigm? What are we going to do? Sometimes what's done is we attack whoever found the anomaly as, a charlatan and doesn't know what they're talking about. It might be that a group of scientists decide, okay, let's start testing that anomaly. And testing always takes the form of attempting to falsify it. And so that causes lay people to think that the scientists are just denying the existence of this anomaly when what in fact they're doing is testing the anomaly. If the anomaly exists, it should stand up against the falsification tests. Like, that's the whole point. So some subset of scientists might start studying that anomaly and start looking for evidence that it's wrong. Maybe in the meantime, actually providing more and more support that it might be right. It might be the true interpretation. This crisis period, usually in a good, healthy, mature science, will cause a refining of the paradigm so that we can return to some semblance of normalcy. Now, I say a good, healthy, long-term, mature science, like let's say physics, they've had these periods where they had a paradigm, Newtonian physics, for example, and everybody dwelled all happily for a while, thinking this is how the world works. And then they were thrown into crisis when, for example, Einstein predicted that the universe is expanding. And so the physicists had to figure out what to do about that claim. One thing that they did was they said, he's crazy. Another thing that they did was start testing his predictions. And it turned out that his predictions were standing up to the falsification tests. And so it actually caused a refining of the paradigm and a moving away from Newtonian physics and towards quantum physics. Okay, so in physics, we've seen it. In psychology, this little baby science, which was founded, basically at the same time that this big turmoil was happening in physics, this little baby science, we haven't really established paradigms that are so well supported that we can just take them as givens. Like, we haven't even gotten to that place yet. There are a few things that I think we could say might be a paradigm in psychology. I think one that I feel pretty comfortable with is the theory of associationism, that the mind looks for connections out in the environment, what caused what. I think that might be kind of a paradigm, but it's not really, and it affects a lot of fields in psychology, not just cognition. It affects learning theory. It affects clinical work, right? This assumption that, things that you've experienced in your childhood are associated in your mind with other things, and that may impact you as an adult. I mean, there are a lot of things that I think associationism has impacts on, but I don't think there's an agreement in psychology that that's a paradigm in our field. And so we are very much in this baby little phase where we haven't even reached a first period of normalcy, let alone, a paradigm shift or anything like that other fields that are older, like chemistry or physics, might have experienced. I know paleontology has experienced many of these kinds of paradigm shifts about like what killed the dinosaurs and other kinds of, plate tectonics and other kinds of things that there have been these big paradigm shifts, and we haven't had that in psychology. According to Thomas Kuhn, psychology is pre-paradigmatic. We have not yet reached a phase where we have paradigms driving our research. So it's really important for me that you understand that we're sort of still this baby little field of psychology where we haven't gotten to that point where we all agree on anything before we start talking about where psychology came from. So psychology BC, which would be before cognitive psychology was founded, the parents or the things that led to the development of cognitive psychology would be very strongly philosophy. All of psychology came out of philosophy. And so it's very much, it doesn't matter what topic in psychology you're talking about, you would say the parents of that topic in psychology is probably philosophy. Now, when we talk about philosophy, there's epistemology, which is trying to understand the nature of knowledge. Like, what is knowledge? So epistemology came out of Aristotle. And, so this is, thousands of years ago, trying to understand what it means to know something and really how to distinguish the truth from incorrect beliefs. These are things that humans have been struggling with for a really long time, and Aristotle just made a really great case for the need to understand knowledge. Now, the group called the British empiricists argued that all knowledge is acquired through experience. This doesn't sound like a huge leap to you probably, but prior to the British empiricists and actually to a lesser extent like Socrates stuff, they talked about how we had to learn everything through experience as opposed to how Plato talked about it, for example. Plato said, you were born knowing everything that humans have ever known, and you just have to be reminded of it. The empiricists said, no, you have to acquire all knowledge through experience. So this was actually an opposing viewpoint. It wasn't like we kind of take it for granted now that you need to be taught things, that you might be born a blank slate, right? British empiricists said that all experience comes through the senses. Like you have to see it or hear it or taste it or feel it, right? Smell it in order for you to actually know something. Now, I mentioned associationism a second ago. The British empiricists were the ones who coined that term, associationism, and said that the complex ideas that we have in our heads come from associations that we have created in our own minds between the sensations that we have gathered, whether those are things that we've seen or heard. Probably, we make these associations between them in an effort to sort of understand these pieces of information. There are rules that govern the associations that will form. And so, for example, temporal contiguity talks about how if two things happen close in time, we are more likely to think that they are somehow related to each other. When I was a student, my professor gave the example of, you hit the pool ball with the cue stick, and then it bumps into another ball, and then that other ball starts to roll. You're probably going to come to the conclusion that the first ball caused the second ball to start rolling, right? And he said, and honestly, it's possible that the second one was about to just start rolling anyway, right? Like you may have had nothing to do with it. Now that sounds ridiculous, but he said, why do we immediately leap to the conclusion that we caused that outcome? Well, because they happened in temporal contiguity. They happen one right after the other. It looked like one of the events led into the other event. So that's one of the rules that governs our formation of associations. And so now we think those two balls' movements are related to each other. Now, I think we could probably get a physicist in here to explain that they are related to each other, but that's a good example, I think, of what our brain does. It looks for things that are happening in time, next to each other, and we go, they probably are related. Similarity, same thing. If two things look alike or act alike or smell similarly, we're going to think that they are related to each other. And then contrast. If one seems to be sort of like the opposite of the other, or seems to be the reflection of the other, right? Like it's a mirror image or something, we're going to think they're probably related to each other, that they in some fashion go together. Like, we think yin and yang go together, even though they are opposites of each other, right? Like they are not causing each other or something like that. We see them as going together because of their contrast. So with associationism in the British empiricist school of thought, we see the budding beginnings of questions that we're going to be studying in cognitive psychology. So we definitely have, philosophy to thank for a lot of things that we talk about in cognitive psychology. Now, for those of you who have taken philosophy, a lot of the things that I'm talking about right now came out of Hobbes and Locke, Hume, Berkeley. So these are philosophers who, were in this time period of a really just robust school of thought in Britain, talking about these kinds of philosophical questions. All right, I think this is a good time to take a break. We'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about what a lot of us say is the beginning of psychology, which is the founding of structuralism. So I will see you in the next video.